Many of the ostensible schemes to try to help Africa, for example, the ESAF, actually had negative consequences. There is considerable evidence to suggest that ESAF uses in Africa basically did much worse. There was a minus 0.3% growth performance compared to non-ESAF developing countries where you had a 1% growth on average. Many other indicators can be looked at, but I have been reminded, of course, to try to rush through this presentation, so I will spare you the gory details.
You have 30 minutes, so don't worry. Go.
Oh, thank you.
You have more time, so don't worry.
Thank you, madam. Okay. The very important question which has come up is the question of the debt. And the external debt situation of many African countries has actually worsened very considerably over the last 3.5 decades or so. In fact, if you take, for example, if you look at the last line in this particular slide, you will find that external debt per capita for sub-Saharan African countries, excluding the Republic of South Africa, was $365, when the GNP per capita annually is 308. Just imagine the implications of this kind of indebtedness for the country. Now, I mentioned earlier that we had a situation where commodity prices were not doing well, and then they did particularly well during the 1970s. And this was, of course, a period which was associated with growth in many developing countries. But towards the end of the 1970s, there was a second spike of oil prices. And this led to the decline of commodity prices thereafter. So as a consequence of this, we find there was an economic slowdown, which was particularly acute, and the impact of the second oil price increases was particularly negative for sub-Saharan Africa. So this is where I would date the decline of African growth performance during the 60s and 70s and the reversal of that to the 1980s. Now, the terms of trade, particularly for Africa, decline, and there are many different indicators depending on your particular taste for reflecting this. Now, what we also find is that the trade share of which Africa accounted has also declined during this period. So, if you look at the last 2 decades, there has been a significant, if you look at the last 2 or 3 decades, there has been some significant shifts. There has been an increasing shift towards trade within Africa, and I wouldn't attribute this principally to the various free trade areas, but there has been increased trade within Africa. There's also been increasing trade with Asia, particularly with China and India, but also with other parts of Asia. This is a significant new development. So Africa is less oriented towards producing for its own colonial masters or for the West more generally, but there have been other significant new developments. Nonetheless, African dependence on primary exports is very high. Almost 80% is accounted. It accounts for almost 80% of total exports. The mineral export dependence, which I mentioned earlier, has been rising, and the concentration of exports has narrowed further. In other words, instead of diversifying your exports, there has been actually a reduction in the profile of exports during this period. There are different measures for this, which I won't get into right now. But the consequence of this kind of transformation which has taken place, and we have to acknowledge that this has been a very, very important structural transformation, has been manifold. I would just mention, since I'm from the Food and Agriculture Organization, that there has been a collapse in food security, as I indicated earlier. and this has been very, very worrying. However, there is a determined effort in recent times by African heads of government to try to reverse this situation. Now, many of you are quite aware that there has been a great deal of talk about how agricultural trade liberalization will be great for Africa, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa. I would urge you to be very, very cautious about such claims. The evidence is actually is very dubious, and even the World Bank's own studies, for example, have suggested that Africa is unlikely to benefit, grosso modo, on average, from agricultural trade liberalization. In fact, there are many reasons why some countries may actually be significantly worse off. Now, this is again from a study of the World Bank in the middle of the last decade, where it shows that basically Africa is not likely to gain from agricultural trade liberalization. But I can assure you that agricultural trade liberalization has actually already occurred. Part of the reason for this, of course, is that you have a situation of agricultural subsidies in the north, which are considered allowable. They are in what the WTO calls the green box, and these are acceptable, allowable subsidies, whereas subsidies from developing countries are basically not allowable. And this is part of the dilemma which developing countries in general face, but African countries in particular are in a dilemma. And you know that in many sub-Saharan African countries, the middle classes are quite happy to have frozen chicken brought in container loads from Europe, for example, because that will lower the price. But this basically means that poultry farming as an option for African farmers is basically undermined. So these are very, very difficult dilemmas. There are interests which are involved, and there are no easy answers, and very often in an ostensibly democratic situation, we do not necessarily have automatically developmental solutions. But the biggest casualty has been the deindustrialization of Africa. For a number of reasons which I won't get into right now, but I think this is now very, very well established. There is a tariff bias against African exports, which encourage primary export rather than the processing of primary commodities, for example, and so on. And you should also be aware that many of the offers which are being made to African countries will result in preference erosion. Right now, African countries, Caribbean countries, and some South Pacific countries enjoy special advantages. Those will basically be eroded by further trade liberalization. So the problem of deindustrialization in Africa has been a serious problem over the last 3 or 3.5 decades, and the likelihood of Africa reindustrializing on a viable basis is actually quite dismal. It's quite dismal for a variety of reasons which we can discuss if time allows. So this table basically reminds us that the the modest industrialization which was achieved in the 1960s and 1970s has basically been reversed in the decades since then. Now, many of you also have been told that if you liberalize your financial markets, there will be a net flow of funds from capital-rich countries to the capital-poor countries. Has this happened? Unfortunately, no. What happens with financial liberalization is you basically have a flight of capital from Africa. And so you have heard in the media reminding us on many different occasions that the flow of capital out of Africa, the flow of private capital out of Africa, in fact exceeds ODA flows into Africa. This is just one element of one dimension of the consequence. As an old friend of mine used to say, it is like opening a bird cage and expecting more birds to fly into the cage than fly out. And this is basically the logic of the argument for financial liberalization. So this chart, this graph basically gives you some idea of financial flows, net financial flows out of Africa, and there's a great deal of evidence as well, some of which is here, but a lot of it is simply not here. But the basic point which is important to remember is that the flows of funds coming into Africa basically involve debt or in some cases involves property rights over African assets. And this is the dilemma which Africans have to face. Again, there's a great deal of evidence which I won't go into details with. But I think it's important to recognize that African payments, okay, debt-related payments now exceed receipts of loans. Okay? Now, I won't get into the net transfers out of Africa. The book could be written using the same title as the famous novel. But basically, I think it's increasing acknowledgement in the economics profession. A conservative economist, for example, has talked about this phenomenon of capital flowing from poor countries to rich countries as capital flowing uphill. Okay? And there is acknowledgement. Okay? And there are many papers and theses being written to try to explain this phenomenon. But the point is the facts have not changed. Now, the point I would also like to make is that financial liberalization, which continues to be advocated, has not been developmental. The effects have been the macroeconomic effects of financial liberalization have been fundamentally deflationary. In other words, it slows down potential economic growth. Another consequence has been the demise of what used to be called development finance. We also find that rather than strengthening financial inclusion, you actually strengthen financial exclusion. And finance into developing countries generally, but especially into Africa, has been pro-cyclical rather than counter-cyclical. Most economies need finance in a counter-cyclical fashion. Okay? Because when you don't have enough finance, you need that finance. But what often happens is that when you left the markets, the financial flows tend to be pro-cyclical rather than counter-cyclical, thus worsening the problems which countries face. Now, another great hope which has often been touted has been FDI. The evidence, however, suggests that the gains have been modest, but it has to be admitted that the amount of investments, foreign direct investments in Africa have also been quite modest. Out of total FDI, Africa accounts for about 2% of total global FDI. And very often, the conditions which are required are policies which are either directly or indirectly not conducive to development. Generally speaking, developed countries, but also other developing countries, expect higher rates of return to FDI in Africa as a condition for coming into Africa. And there is often beggar-than-neighbor competition for FDI, which reduces the net benefits to host economies. So the result has been that a few countries have indeed been very successful in attracting FDI for periods which are often quite limited. So I already mentioned that the African share of global FDI is small, and you will find that most of it has been oriented towards the extractive industries, mainly minerals but increasingly to other types of extraction. For instance, forests, but also other kinds of extraction. The last point which needs to be made in this connection is that aid flows have been notoriously unreliable. And as you know, aid flows have declined in recent years. There was a slight increase for 2013, but this is really due to the fact that the US dollar has weakened against the euro, and so it is a statistical phenomenon rather than a phenomenon which reflects a real increase in flows of capital to developing countries. Now, just to give you a sense of how much the commitment to ODA to Africa is. In the left-hand column, this is a table which I prepared. Almost 20 trillion was committed by the G20 countries for economic recovery after the crisis began in 2008, 2009. The ODA for Africa in 2008, in contrast, was total 26 billion. Okay? So you can get the sense that little sliver, which those of you with better eyesight might notice, is what Africa receives. So net aid transfers have actually been lower, and I'll just draw your attention to the last line here, which is the experience of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I did this calculation some years ago. On paper, there was 5.4 billion in ODA, but the net transfer was only 400 million, because there were so many outpayments to service earlier debt and so on and so forth, that the net transfer was a fraction, less than 10% of what you will find in the ODA reporting, which the OECD DAC does. Now, basically, as a consequence of all this, we find that remittances following the crisis have also been adversely affected to Africa. It should be emphasized that there had been previously a significant growth in remittances to Africa. So what we find is inequality in Africa, which is very significant. And it is more significant in some parts of Africa than in other parts. And it was very interesting this morning to note that the highest inequality we find in the world by region is in Latin America. And this has a lot to do with settler colonialism. And that is why what you find, particularly in the settler colonies in Africa, in Southern Africa and perhaps also in East Africa, is where inequality is highest. Okay? Namibia, for example, has the highest national inequality in the world, and if you go to Namibia, for example, you look at the allocation of land, the distribution of land ownership, and it is no mystery why you have that kind of high inequality. So I want to emphasize that inequality directly affects poverty, hunger, and food insecurity. And the growth in Africa, which has suddenly increased in the last decade, unfortunately has not created very much employment. And this is part of the problem. How do you ensure the kind of structural change which is desirable for sustained development? And this is an important question. And part of it, of course, has to be the question of the reindustrialization of Africa. Not a reversal to the policies of the past, because surely we have learned something from international experience, but rather a forward-looking strategy. And this is also important in agriculture, where it is important for African agriculture to become increasingly competitive. My own country has become relatively well off among developing countries on the basis of plants which were imported. If you go to the river mouth of the Amazon in Belém, you will see a rubber plant there with the inscription, "This is the plant stolen by the British imperialists in the 19th century for its empire in Asia. Okay? And that refers to rubber. The other two countries where Malaysia is now the #1 producer of the product, palm oil, came from West Africa. Cocoa, where Malaysia is also the #1 producer, also comes from West Africa. And there's absolutely no reason why Africa cannot be very, very competitive in these months. We even had to import an insect from Africa, a weevil in Africa, which is very important for the pollination of the oil palm plant. Okay? That shows you how crucial Africa has been in terms of the biodiversity in Africa has been for at least the Malaysian and increasingly now the Indonesian growth of the palm oil industry. So the question which we are confronted with is how do we ensure that the structural transformation in the region, in the continent, addresses the question of inequality. There is clearly a need to promote investment and technology, but do you do so by promoting and privileging foreign investors first, or do we look at why domestic investors are not investing in the country? My simple suggestion to you is that if you look at the East Asian experience, it was achieved principally by looking at what were the constraints, what was discouraging domestic investors from investing. And in Northeast Asia in particular, recognizing those constraints and overcoming those constraints in countries like Japan and Taiwan province of China, as well as the Republic of Korea, was what contributed to the miracles. The Republic of Korea right through the 1960s was way behind Malaysia. Now it is well ahead of Malaysia. And part of the reason was that it industrialized, and less than 2% during the high growth period, less than 2% of total investments were foreign in origin. Okay? And this made the difference. I do not think that there is any compelling reason why any other part of the world cannot achieve this. I do not believe in theories of genetic inferiority or any other cultural explanations, which obviously culture matters. And I'm not suggesting it doesn't. But we also know that there's a great deal of entrepreneurship and a great deal of potential, economic potential in the continent to be released. And as somebody said this morning, it is important that regional integration be appropriate to our times. We have a proliferation of regional free trade arrangements in the continent. And this clearly has not been very conducive to regional integration. We also need to recognize that for a long time to come, it will be extremely difficult to tackle inequality and poverty simply by relying on growth alone. It is important for growth and employment generation to be pursued. It is important for governments to also ensure that the impact of governments is progressive, both on the tax side as well as on the expenditure side. But there is clearly a need to have strengthened social policy. And one important element of social policy, I would put it to you, is to ensure a rapid transition, an accelerated transition from protection to production. Okay, so when we talk about social protection, we're not simply talking about the expansion of the welfare state. We are talking about enabling Africans to be much, much more productive than is the case so far. And this, of course, is a very, very formidable challenge. A challenge which involves, for example, which would never have taken place if not for the kind of ambition and vision of the first president, the first founding father of this nation. So what we need is to also ensure that you have reform of state-owned enterprises with improved accountability. And I must say that I was very, very impressed with how well the Volta River Authority, which runs the dam, was run. We also need to ensure that institutions are accountable in the correct way And I already mentioned the role of the US Fed, for example, in terms of employment. We should ensure more progressive taxation. We must ensure that capacities, government capacities, developmental capacities are strengthened. We must ensure that governments also have the means to pursue economic and social policies and not just security policies. And we have to also ensure that governments have much more policy space than they currently enjoy. And we have to try to ensure, and this is why the post-2015 debate becomes so important, that we have the kind of international cooperation to strengthen the development of productive capacities and capabilities for the kind of structural transformation to which I think we all aspire. Thank you very much for your attention.
And then making some very interesting proposals on what we can do in terms of looking at development governance and moving beyond good governance to looking at development governance and holding governments and leaders accountable for that, and also looking within to improve our circumstances and to address the issues of inequalities. But I'll not attempt to summarize what you said, because we have some panelists who I invite to come up here so that we can.
Comprehensive presentation. I think this presentation plus the speech by the President this morning have really given us a lot of food for thought, and so did the contribution of the panelists. But really, so we have to tackle this, and of course we are talking about transformation, and I think the presentation shows that we really have to present the way that we have been doing things. Perhaps even to try and always do the question of $1 per day or $1.5 US per day, or we made a poverty by the fact that one can afford basic human needs, food, shelter, clothing, safe water, health, education and training and so on. Really, because even the dollar doesn't have the same purchasing power in different places over time. So really we need a truly now, we really a real paradigm shift to achieve that accelerated, stable, sustained, and inclusive growth of creating paradigm complex growth. So that means transforming the sources of contributions to the GDP and that way to GNI in Ghana. And really the need for value addition is very important, and inclusiveness. So I'm just setting the stage for discussion by the panelists. There are funds to deal with this inequality, funds to deal in government and state enterprises, the private sector as well, and the international and regional or sub-regional dimension. One can go into details of what goes on in public, both the revenue generating as well as the manner in which that expenditure is made, but I will not steal the thunder of our panelists. But the question of gender equality is very important. I have to mention this because a well-known report not too long, 2 years ago, was released that showed that investment in women brings more returns than otherwise. So it makes economic sense to go full force into gender equality and women empowerment. And the World Economic Forum also issues annually a report that is called Closing the Gender Gap. Some of the, a few of the African countries have done very well, actually even better than the European or North American countries, but a lot of us have to move much more. And we shall be watching pseudo reports to see how much progress on the ground we are also making. But we also have the youth empowerment and engagement and people with disabilities. And we have to stop this question of lumping them together. I call it garbage can. Women, youth, people with disabilities. They have to be separated because they are all very important groups so that we can focus. One could even go on what could be done in the private sector to reduce inequalities. We said that equalities can be on equivalent fronts. It can be income and wealth distribution, or it can be social, and it can be geographical or spatial, environmental or cultural. So we have various facets of which we can see inequalities. And I think as we will see later in the human rights issue, the question of inequalities is a human rights issue, but at the same time, it's an issue of peace and security. There's peace and security implications. And we want stability that has to be dealt with. That's why there are three main programs now in Africa. The Great Lakes Initiative, where you have the African Union, the United Nations, and the World Bank. Try to see about 16 or so states of the Great Lakes area to see whether the cycle hand in hand of poverty, conflict, whether it may not be broken by attending to economic development. And even before that really takes off, now there is the Sahel initiative by the same parties, and in the making now is the Horn of Africa. So one can go on and on, but I don't want to steal the thunder of our distinguished panelists. Our panelists who are going to really enlighten us on all these issues. I would like to start with Dr. Alex Homam, who is a research fellow at the Center for Global Development. And then
I'm going to go slightly more quickly than my slides presentation, so I'm going to try and get through these points before I end. I'll talk through broadly the type of inequalities that have been discussed, and I hope that acts as something of a framing for the set of inequalities we'll talk about over the next 3 days. I want to talk a bit about what we know, and in particular about what we don't know, the inequalities that we simply don't see, and then about why that matters. That it's not random, it's not coincidental, it's deeply political, and if we want to change things, then we need to understand that and confront it. Finally, in that line, I'll talk about the type of policy targets that are being discussed and the reasons why we might favour some of them over others. Okay. Broadly, I'll talk about economic, social, political and intergenerational inequalities, although I'm going to focus later more on the economic. In the case of all four of them, we can see a common set of dimensions, which I'm calling here vertical and horizontal. They're inequalities between individuals, but they're also horizontal and intersecting inequalities between groups. And that's groups of all sorts. The list here is not exclusive, but we think most commonly of gender groups and ethno-linguistic groups and perhaps spatial groups, whether that's regional or urban, rural. But of course we tend in doing that to overlook some other important groups, not least people living with disabilities, different age groups, people with HIV. intersections of those groups are particularly important and where we see the deepest inequalities. So we shouldn't think of gender and ethnicity as the groupings entirely separately, but actually worry in particular about where they intersect, and that's true across the range of these. In terms of economic inequalities, the particular aspects are of course income and wealth, but not excluding the opportunities for employment and the land ownership that is often somehow set aside when we think about financial wealth only. And of course it's not only levels of income and wealth, but the stability of them, especially for people at the lower end of the distributions. In terms of social inequalities, you'll see I've got the same set of dimensions there again. The aspects here, well, the outcomes, whether that's basic outcomes that matter a great deal, like mortality and literacy, or the access to services that underpin those outcomes, but also more broadly inclusion within communities, or the flip side of that, marginalisation, which of course moves from the social to the political, where the aspects of, can be summarised more or less as the access to and influence over national resources of one type or another, but seen through the ability to have a voice and to have that expressed in effective political representation. And of course we see the outcomes of political inequalities in terms of all the other inequalities. The absence of voice and representation is very directly related to the failure of services to be provided to particular groups or parts of the income distribution. And Derek will talk more about the political inequalities, and Leila will talk more about the intergenerational inequalities. So let me just say I would summarise them broadly as, in terms of sustainability, not only, although of course critically, environmental sustainability, but also the sustainability of economic, social and political progress, where it is often, particularly with the type of political systems we have, tempting to go for short-term gains that may well be to the cost of subsequent generations. I think the fact you're here probably means you know a good deal about the costs of inequality, so I won't spend too long on this, but except to say they're both inherent in the sense of simply being unjust, but also instrumental. And we know the evidence is very clear, especially on the economic inequality side, that inequality leads directly to people having worse lives in a multitude of dimensions, but also has instrumental costs in terms of the economic outcomes, lower economic growth, shorter spells of economic growth, greater risk of political conflicts and of violence. Okay, but there is a great deal that we don't know, or that we know very imperfectly, and if we think about the different dimensions I've talked about, perhaps the most exciting feature of the post-2015 development framework discussions is the emphasis on the disaggregation of data and setting targets that would not be considered met unless they were met for each individual group for which data would be thereby required. But we're starting from a very low base. I'm going to argue this is not random. In terms of the vertical inequalities, on the economic side, we know a certain amount about income distribution, although the data is far from perfect. We have a certain amount of information, although it's getting worse, about employment. We often know very little about the distribution of wealth, of land, about the stability of economic opportunities as they affect different parts of, let's say, the income distribution. In terms of social inequalities, we tend to have better data about some key outcomes, particularly ones in the MDGs, but rather less on the access to services that underpins them, and certainly in terms of inclusion, we're starting to get pretty vague in most cases. Politically, we have data on representation. We know who's in Parliament, but we know a lot less about the involvement of different parts of the income distribution in political processes, and we don't even have systematic indicators for much of that. In terms of intergenerational inequalities, we are often in the dark in general. But it gets worse when we think about horizontal inequalities. The darker the shading here, broadly, the more I think we have some data and some understanding of the picture. And this is just thinking about the particular groups in respect to particular areas of inequality. If we start thinking about the intersection of these groups, the picture gets worse and worse. And actually, I'm only intersecting this twice. In a sense, we ought to be considering all the intersections, and if I could do you a seven-dimensional picture in a PowerPoint, I would, and it would be blank. We have very little information about the multiple intersects in most cases. What we have tends to come from household surveys and has its own set of weaknesses. Okay, so we know a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of the other, and we hope to come out with some answers, some things that would drive policy to target the most important inequalities in a given context. But what we don't know is not random. What is uncounted is not coincidental, it is the result of power. And the power to count and to make those decisions about what gets counted and what gets reported is itself a part of inequality that we should care very much about. There's two main ways of being uncounted. The first is through a lack of power. Typically, we have much worse information about the bottom end of all sorts of distributions and about marginalised groups. We have very, very little data on people living with disabilities globally because there simply hasn't been a political decision to put the emphasis there. You could summarise that as saying that we don't care enough. And perhaps, if we think about it, we do, but that doesn't get translated into the action to start collecting that data. So the lack of information about particular groups is another aspect of their marginalisation, is another deepening of the inequalities that they face. At the other end, though, there are things and people that go uncounted through, if you like, an excess of power. And here I'm thinking in particular about illicit financial flows, about the kind of tax evasion of both individuals and companies that so often goes uncounted, unreported, undetected, unchallenged, because of the power of corporations to change the international corporate tax system to enable this, because of the power of jurisdictions to maintain financial secrecy that allow and facilitate tax evasion and a set of other crimes. So what goes uncounted, whether through a lack of power or an excess of power, is itself an important dimension of inequalities. And therefore it matters what we count and what we target, because targeting is often what drives the counting. The decision to set a target, for example, on gender inequality in the Millennium Development Goals, that drove a lot of focus on those statistics. All right. I am going to run through a whole set of things that I would have talked about but won't, except to say that we need to be careful with targets because often these two are manipulated if we're not counting carefully. Just say two more things. One about inequality. I have a proposal with Andy Sumner from last year for a measure of inequality that is very simple and we think lends itself to accountability. So if you were looking for a target to hold policymakers to account on income inequality, we propose this, the Palmer, the ratio of the top 10% share of national income to the bottom 40%. And the reason for choosing this is the work of Gabrielle Palmer, which suggests the 50% share in the middle is actually very stable across countries and over time. So the real shifts in distribution are between the top 10% and bottom 40%. As you see, the green bit at the bottom is the middle bit. It's not moving a lot. The difference is between the red and the blue, the red being the bottom 40% share. That's where income inequality is. So if we want to target, our proposal is to target it on.
They can go and stay in school is a very, very important sentence because in Ethiopia, early marriage is a very big problem. Basically, that family law not only gives access to work and access to properties, but also raised the age of marriage from 15 to 18. That's why we have a lot of problems when it comes to retaining girls in high schools, especially in some specific regions. it may not make sense for you to tell you the specific regions, but Amhara, one of the largest ethnic groups, which really populates the Central Highlands plus the Northwest Highlands, is a region where we have the biggest problem of early marriage. Therefore, the family law introduction and its impact is being studied. We haven't completed the impact of this law in terms of empowerment, but it is making some improvements. Because as you said, it is complex, because families, they just arrange a party and they say it is just a graduation party, but they give away their daughters. So we have big problems.
So this ranking, was it an improvement or a deterioration? Has the family law done something discernible to improve the situation of women in Ethiopia?
Yes, to some extent in some regions. But generally, there is also a statistical point when it comes to the ranking. I think it's not only Ethiopia, but if you go for the overall inequality-adjusted human development indicators, including malnutrition, maternal mortality, and a range of other indicators, which you have been hearing about, 24 out of the 25 lowest ranked countries are in Africa. So we have to have a common position. And only Afghanistan is among us. So you know what that is.
Let me turn back to Nigeria, Professor Rio. On the social front, in terms of inequality in Nigeria, how does it manifest itself in terms of the provision of social services? That's one area. But the one and also that's interesting, I think, in the minds of many, is what is the relationship between inequality and the position, sort of the geopolitical zones, the 6 geopolitical zones in Nigeria? How do they map in terms of the inequality distribution in Nigeria?
Like I said earlier, the social services are not in good shape. It's part of every expenditure over the years. They are either non-existent or dysfunctional. In most cases, you have some completed structures, facilities, they are not producing and they are not useful. That is affecting so many things in terms of inequality. For example, even as Atlanta, Nigeria, compared to some areas, the so-called developed areas, the quality of educational facilities is very appalling. The quality of health services is not acceptable. Very limited number of people have access to potable water across the country, and so many others. But the education story is totally different from that. In terms of geopolitical zones, I think there are some underlying currents, bordering on culture or religion. There are some underlying beliefs regarding the relationship between leadership and rulership. Okay? For example, in some other parts of the country, people question leadership. Why do they have this? Why do they have that? In some other areas, they worship the leaders. And in fact, some people relish or assess their importance in terms of the number of people they have to look out at to feed on the daily basis. Which are not things we can quantify here. Incidentally, people look more at the other parts of the country in terms of as the poorest segment of the country. But to look at resource, especially official resource flows, it was much more concentrated in that same area until the advent of this oil derivation fund, about 30%, where the South area now has a lot of resources. But even then, again, the rate of growth of resource inflows in those areas far outstrip the rate of growth of the quality and quantum of social services in those areas. I think it actually has to do with the problem of inability of people to know their rights and enforce their rights. Then I believe it also has some cultural dimensions. When you know that some people are living in affluence and you don't have the courage, or by some indoctrination, you cannot question them. And those are some of the emerging statistics and picture regarding this problem with the Nigerian environment.
I'm curious because it seems to me like the absorptive capacity to actually make a difference in people's lives seems to be a major constraint in Nigeria. We heard earlier from Dr. Mohammed. Can you hear me now? We heard earlier from Dr. Amina Mohammed that they tried to spend $1 billion to deal with MDGs, and they found it hard to spend that money effectively. And you talked about $25 billion spent on social services, but with very little impact on the quality of those social services. Let's go to the second largest economy in Africa. Professor. A colleague of mine who works for a bank in South Africa said that the government of South Africa has about 350,000 vacancies in the civil service. And they can't fill them because they do not find qualified South Africans to fill them. And yet, there are many unemployed young people in South Africa. What is wrong with or what is not happening with the education system to be able to bridge this gap?
Thank you very much again, Mr. Moderator. To answer this question, let me say that when you look at our paper, you find out that we looked at the dynamics and the drivers of social and economic inequalities in South Africa over time, based on availability of data. And in terms of education, what is really very amazing for me as a person is that only about, from when we did the data analysis overall, nationally, only about 1.5% of South Africans have at least a bachelor's degree or higher degree. And that was a bit surprising from the analysis that we did. I hope I'm correct, Statistics in general. But at the same time, we also looked at the initial low base of South Africa in terms of education disparities. There are disparities in terms of public sector education as well as privately provided education. And you will see that based on those disparities, we came up with some recommendations. One of the first recommendations in the study is that South African government would possibly have to look at the opportunity of attracting highly qualified professionals, even from outside South Africa, who can come and transfer knowledge, who can come and impart knowledge, who can come and support the economy, so that at the end of the day, there will be transfer of knowledge, transfer of skills, and that can be also in terms of technology transfer, in terms of education. But that is one way. That is not enough. Another way is also to look at South Africa in a way that why should we have high youth unemployment rate? I think as of now, as of 2012, the unemployment rate in South Africa is around 25%, which is high. And when you look at the youth unemployment rate, it's even up to around 55%, if not more. So the question is, how do we capacitate young South Africans so that people can get proper education? Just 2 weeks ago, we had a long interaction with one of the best South African experts by the name Professor Borat. And we talked about what we can do. He was of the opinion that we should not, South African government should not continue to spend a lot on primary education. Because in terms of primary education enrollment, when you look at that particular MDG, South Africa as a country has already met it. But the question is how we graduate people from primary school to secondary school and then to tertiary education. But at the same time, we told him we must not forget about tertiary education. We must not forget about getting young South African students into universities, skilling them, and also look at other aspects of education that we may not necessarily call formal education. And that could be in terms of vocational or what South African government does that is called further education training programs, colleges. Just about a month ago, I decided to move around the provinces of South Africa with a few colleagues in the office. And when we moved around, we went to the Northwest province. And we decided to go into the Northwest University, as well as the Further and Education Training College in Northwest, in Mafikeng. And we saw the disparities in terms of how students are learning and what they are learning and how they can better learn more. So overall, to answer your question in a straightforward manner, I think South African government shouldn't shy away from making use of experts, even across Africa or from other parts of the world, to help impart knowledge, help impart skills, transfer skills, and then those skills retained in the country, so that overall South African youth themselves can continue to drive the economy of the country. Thank you.
A very quick question with asking a very short answer. Do you think South African youth will be patient enough to be trained and capacitated and empowered by foreigners?
Very good question, particularly when you look at the history of the South African country in recent years. But the idea is that we should have medium to long-term approaches. There will be the short-term approaches, to deal with the issue. There will be the long-term ones, and there will be medium-term ones. For the long-term ones, that is when we need to bring in other experts to support, to help, and that can be done in different ways. I'm sure what we are doing right now at the UNDP country office, we have what we call the Supply Development Program. Through that program, we are able to conduct certain study talks. We take a lot of South Africans, those who are starting businesses, and it will surprise you to know that at every point in time in South Africa right now, there are about 5 million small and medium enterprises. But unfortunately, about 60% of them die just before they reach 18-month maturity. So what we've been trying to do is we take some youth to certain countries in Mexico, in Brazil, and other parts of the world, so that they
sometimes associated with elections, but mostly around grievances associated with lack of opportunities. So the youth issue is a big problem in Kenya, and the manufacturing sector and the service sector, which in developed countries typically absorb most of these young people, is not growing large enough, quickly enough to take them. So it's a big problem. And the regional opportunities available still have not yet been able to address the problem adequately. First, because in spite of the what you can call agreements and pacts at the elite level, what in the East African region, I think they call it's like a summit of presidents. The trickle down to young people is not still felt, except maybe at the level of education or maybe entertainment. So many artists from Tanzania and Kenya, and also Uganda, and increasingly Rwanda, can cross borders, entertain each other, join universities across border. That's working much more easily. So maybe the young people are already embracing the region, but the region is not offering them enough opportunities. Today, if you go to Kampala, there is a university called Kampala International University, which has been rechristened Kenya International University, because more than 70% of the students in that place are Kenyans. So the young people seem to have embraced the idea of the region, but the region does not seem to have developed or created enough opportunities to absorb them. And because of the question of inequality and a few opportunities available to young people, especially if you are from regions that are marginal in terms of agricultural productivity, or you are in an urban setting where 60% of people are living in slums, the chances for upward mobility are extremely low. And for that reason, Kenya is like a tinderbox. Any point at which some social issue becomes hot, it's very easy for it to spill over into violence.
You're frightening us, Jeremiah. Let me ask Sheila to make an intervention, and then before we continue, I'm going to give, if there are some 2 or 3 people, 1 minute each to make ask a question or make an intervention. 1 minute. I hope the microphones work. But let's listen to Dr. Sheila.
Thank Thank you. Well, since we were on the question of education, particularly higher education, I just wanted to add that this problem of the mismatch between the labor market and the education and training system has been a persistent one in Mauritius. Ever since we became independent, the problem is still very much there. Now, we are also in the business of opening our doors. We are beginning to treat education, there is a kind of a commodification of education, so it's becoming a business. And in the process of opening up this education sector and creating a number of private universities to attract students from the region, there has been evidence, and increasing evidence, that there are a number of malpractices in terms of the regulations and in terms of the illegality of these higher education systems, the quality, etc. The reason I'm raising this is because earlier on this morning we were talking about what does Africa need, and what do we want. And it is a very serious problem because on the one hand, if we are opening our doors, basically saying that we are knowledge and therefore we can attract students from the region, and then we discover that these people are being exploited for so very many reasons in terms of the absence of quality, and this has been proved now, and there are a number of cases which people are trying to put forward. There are students not only from Africa who come to Mauritius for higher education and are caught into this business of the illegal structures which are operating, but also students from other places, other parts of the developing world in particular. So I think we have a problem, and I wanted to connect this with the question of, if you allow me, Chair, with the question of regionalization, because I think there are, we're talking about inequality, but there is not only internal inequality, there is also the question of governance, and what I want to factor in here is the question of ethical governance, because on the one hand, we are saying, for example, one example that I take in this paper is that we are setting up a kind of a financial jurisdiction whereby we can attract people to come and invest. And in fact, there is so much happening in this particular context that civil society in Kenya is beginning to throw up a lot of noise, because the reality is that through the double taxation agreement and treaty shopping that we're doing, basically we are attracting funds from many parts of Africa, but in this particular instance, the Kenyan case is a very interesting scenario that needs to be thought about, because Kenyan civil society is basically saying, well, many rich Kenyans are letting their money flow into the financial jurisdiction of Mauritius and evading taxes, particularly corporate taxes of about 30%. So if they are evading 30% of taxes there, and we are tolerating that by claiming that we are a low-tax financial jurisdiction, then I'm wondering what kind of regional cooperation are we as Africa talking with one same voice, and we better be serious about this talking with one same voice and have a common position if we really want development for each and every one. Because I think this is impacting very severely. In fact, the article that I quoted in this paper is that it is impacting very severely on the possibility of addressing inequality in Kenya. Certainly Mauritius did better in this particular instance in Kenya. I just wanted to be just.
Okay, the conversation. Here's a Kenyan response to your.
Not particular response, but just a qualification on the issues I raised. The Mauritius issue is becoming a hot potato in Kenya. But again, in terms of the youth issues, one of the important things and salient issues I did not mention in my previous speaking was in regard to some of the measures taken to address the issue of youth unemployment. There is what you call the Youth Enterprises Development Fund that has been in existence for a couple of years, and is meant to help the youth set up businesses because of the lack of formal employment opportunities. The second measure has been provision which is basically administrative in terms of 30% of public procurement opportunities being reserved for women, youth, and persons with disability. So it's not as if there is nothing which is being done. I don't want to sound the most pessimistic. Something is being done, but again, in view of the broader context of needs, sometimes it looks as if nothing is happening, but something is really happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Now, I've seen one hand, that gentleman in white. I've seen a second hand over here, one more hand from this side of the room. Otherwise, I'm auctioning it for a lot of money to this gentleman.
Panelists. I'm Neil Pierre. I'm from the Caribbean. I'm not from Africa, so I'm an outsider. But Sheila, in fact, answered my first question, which was really about what is being done to address what is obviously a mismatch between education and training and the labour market needs, both present and future. But let me ask another question, and I'd like to hear a response from the other presenters in terms of their experiences in their respective countries. We heard about Mauritius. But my other question has to do more with the fact that I think if you're addressing issues of unemployment in particular, an integrated approach really might yield the best possible results. Looking at it not just in terms of a macroeconomic issue, but a macroeconomic, social, and environmental concern. And I wonder to what extent that is being factored into the policy making that is targeted towards employment issues or unemployment in any of the countries. Thank you.
Yes, our problematic region, you know. So I just want to comment three major issues. Very quick, without details. We should accept that growth will never be inclusive, but we should accept there should be fairness in distributing that tax. Sorry? Fairness to distribute the goods. Growth always prefers some areas, especially some towns, and that's we shouldn't have a problem with that. But we should look very much on how we are really offer some kind of fairness to the rest. The second issue that I also, if you look to all countries in the region, there are always two ways of looking to that. From a political perspective, you find in Kenya, in Sudan, for example, I will give you example always our region, you will find that always there is a leading areas, ecologically enjoyed, and then you have the lagging areas where they are lagging in the dry land to be geographically deprived. So in that situation, as we say in Sudan, the nature is mountain, you can't change it. But you can also make sure that those people who are in the wrong place, they can also receive kind of fair services from the government. I will not go into details how the government should do that. That is a policy issue. My second point, it's very clear that from the example from South Africa, from South Africa, we should go beyond not only to look for the income as one of the sources of this inequality, but we should go beyond that to see the family background. Myself, I'm a pastoralist. I used to talk up to the university levels. I failed to go for any other business despite my education. It is very hard not to go for this entrepreneurship. The family background has also very much responsibility in also to motivate people and diversify them. Then the issue is not an income, but also the source of income, the source of economic growth. Those who are in that area generated, that will also determine very much the way that we are looking to this structural transformation.
Thank you very much, sir. I work with Site Savers as Social Inclusion Advisor for Africa, and a member of the board of the National Council of Persons with Disabilities in Ghana. My question is that our presenters have given us a great deal of information and learning. And in their research and the presentation, they did cite examples. So like I could say Mauritius talked about children, Ethiopia gender, and the various groupings and various evidence that is shared. Did they include persons with disabilities within the target? So if it's children, were they children with disabilities in the target group that they studied? And if it was missing, then how do we do that so that we don't miss it any longer? Because we all agree that disability, it must be very inclusive for us to avoid or achieve equality. Thank you.
In your study, and if not, how do you propose perhaps to improve future analysis to include this? Otherwise, as Alex was mentioning, the excluded counting also is a manifestation of inequality.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Well, I must admit, for the sake of brevity of the report, I mean, we couldn't actually include disability, but of course, there's also a bigger statement that actually has done a good analysis on disability in Ghana. Of course, disability issues are very pertinent as far as development discourse is concerned, because in many times we don't seem to include their concept into development agenda. Issues of education, issues of access to healthcare and to buildings and employment often they are neglected. But which I believe that is key, because if you look at the data that is currently available, you realize that the greater majority of disabled people are within the economically inactive population, which suggests that many of them are actually poor and they are unable to participate in the country's current economic growth process, which means that a greater number of them are actually left behind. But of course, if you also look at the various interventions of government, you realize that many of them are being targeted, particularly with the Honorable Manoyin Taisia. She actually takes charge of the social protection issues. And if you look at the cash transfer programs that we have, many of them which are within the extreme form are the disabled people, and therefore the society seems to now begin to take some of their concerns on board. And then also the common fund the decentralization program that we have, where we take a certain percentage of revenues to the district, also target 2% of the targets the disabled, trying to create employment for disabled people within the district level. And also even with our own flagship program, the NHIS also have something for the disabled and extreme poor people to be able to access healthcare. So these are some other programs that have been placed in recent times to try to address disabled or people living with disability.
Thank you. I know I put you in the hot seat on that one, but I think you acquitted yourself well. Madam Chairman is telling me that it's time to close it, but if I was to just sort of encapsulate what I took away from this, is that everybody seems to be suggesting that there is structural transformation, whether it's oil in Nigeria or the end of one particular era here in Mauritius. This structural transformation is actually putting us at a crossroads where inequality seems to be increasing, with the exception of Ethiopia. And Ethiopia's exception is because there's a deliberate effort by the government to tackle inequality head-on, as it were. But urban inequality is increasing. So keep them out of the cities then, they're better off in the rural areas. But I think also, just to connect it a little bit to some of the issues that were raised in the last session, measuring the data issue, we have to be a lot more careful about trying to measure. And one of your celebrated sons and a good friend of mine, Bright Simmons, says every mobile phone we carry is now a detector of some sort. So we can use mobile phones or that technology to begin to measure more interestingly. And the second thing was Dr. Cobham said, perhaps we should set and monitor inequality targeting. And perhaps Ethiopia can show us the way in terms of looking at how we have this, not just growth targets, but share of income targets across various areas. And the third one is political power. We didn't really get to it, but you mentioned corruption, the lack of institutional absorptive capacity to actually make effective use of the money that is given to them. There's a very interesting IMF paper I would recommend, which suggests, strangely for the IMF, that decentralization of government expenditure is good for reducing inequality if you have three conditions that are met. One, government expenditure has to be big. Secondly, the expenditure has to happen at a very much a local level. And thirdly, the local governments have to be able to be independent of transfers from the center. So, Madam Minister, I leave that with you. the center is supposed to be shrinking in order for inequality to be reducing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Aiden. Thank you. Very interesting panel discussion, very informative.
Still a listener. For those of you who have the invitation cards for the dinner tonight, please pick the invitation cards from the registration desk. Tomorrow we will not be in this room. We will be in Committee Hall 1. That is on this side of the building. When you come in, is then right, Committee Hall 1. So we'll have the sessions there, and then we'll let you know where the breakout sessions will also be. Just a little information on just the caution. I mean, like Accra is like any big city, so please be careful of your equipment, your laptops, and so on. Please, when you come in here, make sure that you have an eye on it at every time. So that's that. Somebody doesn't liberate them or liberate it. So we'd like to thank you very much. We have refreshment outside, we'll have one.